Imagine a story from the Bible about how God put Adam into a deep sleep, took out one of his ribs, and poof, made Eve. Churches, books, and even movies have told this story for centuries. It's one of the most famous stories about how men and women came to be. But what if I told you that's not exactly what happened? The Hebrew word for rib in that story doesn't even mean rib at all. This mistranslation, which has persisted for thousands of years, could have caused a significant misunderstanding. This mistranslation may have led to a distorted perspective on the relationship between men and women. In this story, the original Hebrew word tzela signifies more than just ribs. In fact, tzela, the original Hebrew word used in this story, refers to something much bigger, like the entire side of something. If Adam's entire side, rather than a single rib, was the source of Eve's creation, everything would change. This implies that Eve was not a mere secondary creation, but rather an equal, a partner, destined to stand beside Adam. In Genesis 2:21-22, the Bible says God took something from Adam to create Eve. Most translations call it a rib, but the Hebrew word zela doesn't mean rib in any other part of the Bible. Everywhere else it means side, a large foundational part of something important. In Exodus 26:20, zela describes the sides of the tabernacle, the sacred structure where God's presence dwelled. These weren't small pieces. They were the walls that held the tabernacle together. Similarly, in 1 Kings 6:5, zela refers to the sides of Solomon's temple, another sacred and massive structure. If tzela means side in these contexts, why would it suddenly mean rib in Genesis? It doesn't add up. Instead, the original text suggests something far more profound. God took an entire side of Adam, flesh, bone, and spirit, to create Eve. This wasn't a small, insignificant part of him. It was half of who he was, symbolizing equality and unity. In Genesis 1:27, God created mankind in his own image. Male and female, he created them. God created men and women with equal dignity and value, reflecting the image of God from the very beginning. Adam's creation of Eve serves as further evidence of this. Adam's created Eve to stand beside him as an equal, not to be above or beneath him. Genesis 2:24 speaks of man and woman becoming one flesh. This isn't just poetic, it's a reflection of their original creation. Adam's took Eve from his side to unite them as two components of one whole. The story is about partnership, not hierarchy. In the ancient world, people often viewed women as property or inferior to men. But the creation story in Genesis, when understood correctly, was revolutionary. It presented men and women as equal partners, designed to work together and complement each other. Unfortunately, the mistranslation of tzela as rib led to centuries of misunderstanding. The translators chose the word plura, which can mean both rib and side, when they first translated the Bible into Greek, the Septuagint, 3rd century BCE. Later, in the Vulgate, Latin, 4th century CE, this became costae, meaning rib. By the time the King James Version underwent translation in 1611, rib had become an integral part of the story. The interpretation of zela as a rib created the impression that Eve originated from something small and less significant. Over time, this reinforced harmful stereotypes about women being secondary or inferior to men. It even shaped cultural norms, influencing how people viewed gender roles for generations. When we return to the original meaning of tzela, the story becomes a powerful reminder of unity. Eve wasn't an afterthought or a lesser creation. She was part of Adam's very being, created to stand alongside him as an equal. This understanding aligns with the rest of the Bible's teachings about relationships. In Genesis 2:24, they shall become one flesh. This reflects the unity God intended for men and women, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. In Ephesians 5:2-8-29, the Apostle Paul urges husbands to love their wives as their own bodies, emphasizing care and equality in marriage. In Galatians 3:28, There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. This verse reinforces the Bible's broader message of equality. When read in its original context, the creation story explores more than just the creation of men and women. It explores their purpose, unity, partnership, equality. The notion that Eve originated from Adam's side, not his rib, demonstrates the inherent design of men and women to collaborate, complement, and support each other. This interpretation also challenges us to rethink how we view relationships today. It invites us to move beyond outdated stereotypes and embrace the Bible's original message that men and women are equal in value, dignity, and purpose. The word tzela appears in Genesis 2:21-22, describing what God took from Adam to create Eve. For centuries, we have translated this as rib, but the original Hebrew word tzela does not specifically mean rib. Instead, other parts of the Bible often translate it as side or flank, making it a broader term. Tzela appears over 40 times in the Old Testament, and in almost every instance, it refers to something structural and substantial, not just a small part of a body. For example, in Exodus 26:20, Tzela describes the sides of the tabernacle, the sacred structure where the Israelites worshipped. These weren't tiny pieces. They were integral parts of the building. Similarly, the term describes the side chambers of Solomon's temple in 1 Kings 6:5, reinforcing the idea of something significant and supportive. Now think about how that changes the story in Genesis. If tzela doesn't mean a small rib, but instead refers to a whole side of Adam, it paints a picture of Eve's creation as something far more equal and integral. This wasn't just God using a spare part, it was a deliberate act of forming Eve from an essential part of Adam's being. This mistranslation wasn't random. It happened through a chain of linguistic decisions that began thousands of years ago. The translators chose the Greek word pleura when they first translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek in the Septuagint around the 3rd century BCE. Here's where things get tricky. Pleura can mean side, but it can also refer to ribs or parts of the chest cavity. The ambiguity of the word created confusion, which carried over into later translations. Fast forward to the 4th century CE, when St. Jerome translated the Bible into Latin, the Vulgate. He translated pleura as costae, which specifically means rib in Latin. This narrowed the meaning significantly. By the time the King James Version, 1611, translated the Bible into English, the idea of rib became the standard interpretation, and it stuck. Words aren't just symbols, they shape how we think. The mistranslation of tzela into rib had profound consequences, influencing not just theology but also culture and society. The idea that Eve came from a rib led to interpretations that framed women as smaller or less significant than men. Religious teachings reinforced patriarchal views by suggesting that women were subordinate or secondary. Art and literature across centuries reflected this idea. Renaissance paintings often depicted Eve as fragile, emerging delicately from Adam's side, while sermons emphasized her dependence on him. These teachings and images shaped societal norms, ingraining the idea that men were superior and women should follow. The mistranslation overlooked the richness of the Hebrew language. In its original context, tzela suggests something structural and essential, like the sides of sacred buildings. This implies Eve's creation was an act of equality, not inferiority. When we return to the original Hebrew text, the story becomes clear. God didn't take a small piece of Adam to create Eve. He took an entire side, emphasizing unity and partnership. This interpretation aligns with the broader message of Genesis. Genesis 1:27 states that God created both males and females in his own image. God created both men and women equally, imbuing them with a shared value and purpose. Genesis 2:24, they shall become one flesh. This phrase reinforces the idea of equality, symbolizing the unity of men and women as partners. By understanding the linguistic depth of Zella, we can reclaim the original intent of the creation story, a narrative of balance and harmony, not hierarchy. When rib became the standard interpretation of Eve's creation in the Septuagint and later translations, it introduced a subtle but powerful idea. Women were made from something small, almost insignificant. Over time, this interpretation reinforced a cultural hierarchy that placed men above women. In patriarchal societies, this reading of the creation story was used to justify the subordination of women. The idea that Eve was created as an afterthought or helper to Adam became a cornerstone of teachings that positioned men as leaders and women as followers. Cultural stereotypes. Women were often seen as weaker or less capable because they were said to have been made from a small bone rather than an equal part of Adam's body. This perspective extended beyond religious teachings. It permeated art, literature, and cultural norms, generating a lasting impact that persists to this day. Throughout history, art and literature played a major role in spreading and solidifying the idea of Eve's creation from a rib. Consider Renaissance art. Paintings, such as Michelangelo's depiction of Eve's creation in the Sistine Chapel, show her delicately emerging from Adam's side, emphasizing a sense of fragility and dependence. Literary interpretations. Many texts portray Eve's creation as a secondary act, reinforcing the idea of women's submissive roles in relationships. These depictions didn't just reflect the mistranslation, they magnified it, shaping how people across cultures perceived gender roles. By presenting Eve as lesser, these works reinforced the belief that men were the dominant gender. Many religious traditions used the rib interpretation to argue that women were designed to be subordinate to men, limiting their roles in leadership and ministry. This interpretation was cited in sermons and teachings, emphasizing that women were created from men and were therefore meant to serve men. People often use the story of Eve's creation to frame marriage as a hierarchy in which the husband leads and the wife follows. People misinterpreted Eve's role as a helper as evidence of inequality rather than partnership. Over time, the mistranslation became a theological justification for unequal gender roles, influencing how societies viewed everything from household duties to professional opportunities. When we understand Zella as side rather than rib, the creation story paints a very different picture, one of unity, equality, and partnership. Adam did not create Eve from a small part of himself. He formed her from his side, symbolizing that she was his equal, not a subordinate. The original text emphasizes that men and women should collaborate, supporting and complementing one another. This isn't just a minor correction, it's a powerful shift in how we understand the Bible's message about gender and relationships. Revisiting the story of Adam and Eve in its original context challenges long-standing patriarchal interpretations. It forces us to confront how a single mistranslation was used to justify unequal power dynamics. From religious institutions to workplaces, the concept of Eve as inferior contributed to systems where men held more power. Harmful stereotypes. The mistranslation reinforced cultural beliefs that women were naturally weaker or less capable, limiting their opportunities and silencing their voices. Correcting this interpretation doesn't just change how we read the Bible, it challenges the cultural norms built on that misunderstanding. The original text of Genesis paints a much richer picture than the traditional rib interpretation allows. When God created Eve from Adam's side, not a rib, it symbolized something profound: equality and shared purpose. Here's why this matters. The idea that Eve originated from Adam's side illustrates how men and women are two parts of a larger whole. They weren't made to compete or dominate, but to complement each other, like two sides of the same structure. This mirrors God's intention for all relationships: balance, partnership, and mutual respect. Creating Eve from Adam's rib could suggest that she was a smaller, less significant part of him. However, Eve's creation from his side implies equal standing, partners destined to walk together. This is consistent with Genesis 1:27, which affirms that God created both men and women in his image, endowing them with the same divine dignity and purpose. The phrase "one flesh" in Genesis 2:24 takes on new meaning when seen through the lens of the original text. It's not about dominance or submission. It's about two individuals coming together as equals, forming a unified whole. By restoring this interpretation, we reclaim the original beauty of the creation story, a message of partnership that transcends cultural and historical biases. For centuries, the mistranslation of Tsela influenced people's understanding of relationships, frequently establishing a hierarchy that viewed men as superior to women. But when we return to the original meaning, it invites us to reinterpret not only the story of Adam and Eve, but the relationships we build in our own lives. The corrected interpretation of Tsela emphasizes that marriage is a partnership, not a hierarchy. It's about two people bringing their unique strengths and perspectives to create something greater together. This view aligns with the teachings of the New Testament, such as Ephesians 5:21, which encourages mutual submission and respect between spouses. Reinterpreting Tsela as a side challenges the outdated gender roles that have been justified by the rib narrative. It's a reminder that both men and women are equally capable of reflecting God's image and fulfilling his purpose. This empowers individuals to embrace their full potential, regardless of societal expectations or limitations. The story of Adam and Eve isn't just about marriage. It's a model for all human relationships. It teaches us that unity and collaboration are at the heart of God's design, whether in families, communities, or the world at large. Reclaiming the true meaning of Tsela isn't just about theology. It has profound cultural and social implications. It prompts us to scrutinize other presumptions and customs that might have stemmed from misinterpretations or incorrect translations. A single word altered the way people viewed gender roles for centuries. Correcting it reminds us to approach ancient texts with care and humility, always seeking deeper understanding. Many cultural practices and teachings have been based on the rib narrative. Revisiting the original text challenges us to reevaluate these traditions and align them with the message of equality and unity found in the Bible. Understanding Tsela's perspective reinforces the idea that inequality was never part of God's plan. It's a call to address the injustices and imbalances that have arisen from centuries of misinterpretation and to work toward a more equitable world. In a world still grappling with issues of gender inequality, revisiting the creation story offers hope and inspiration. It reminds us that the Bible's original message is one of equality and partnership, not hierarchy. By restoring this truth, we can empower women. By acknowledging that women and men are equals, we can challenge outdated stereotypes and create opportunities for greater inclusion and opportunity. Reinterpreting Tsela as side doesn't just restore a single narrative. It reclaims the truth of how men and women were designed to live together. Eve wasn't an afterthought or an accessory. She did not come from a small, insignificant part of Adam. He created her from his side, symbolizing equality in every sense. This isn't just a correction of language, it's a restoration of God's original vision for humanity. When we think of Adam and Eve, we shouldn't see hierarchy or dominance. Instead, we should see balance. Two halves of a whole, meant to work together, support one another, and reflect the image of God equally. Their story is a reminder that equality isn't a modern idea. It's a divine design rooted in creation itself. It's astounding to think that a single misunderstanding could ripple through history and culture, reinforcing stereotypes and limiting opportunities. For generations, the rib narrative fueled the belief that women were somehow less than men, secondary, smaller, weaker. But the original text of Genesis tells a different story, one of unity and mutual respect. If this journey has opened your eyes, challenging what you thought you knew and uncovering new truths, now is the perfect moment to show your support. By clicking Super Thanks, you're directly helping us keep creating content that digs deep, asks big questions, and explores the mysteries of our shared history. This raises a question: what other stories might we be misunderstanding? If a single mistranslation could alter how we view relationships, what other truths might we uncover if we dig deeper into scripture, language, and context? Zella's story serves as a reminder to challenge our prevailing beliefs and explore the true significance of the words. Reclaiming the true meaning of the Adam and Eve story isn't just about correcting the past, it's about reshaping the present and future. The story of Adam and Eve was never about winning. It's a story about partnership, a vision of two people standing side by side, equal in value and purpose. By reclaiming this truth, we not only honor the original message of Genesis, but also create space for a more just and harmonious world. As you contemplate the discoveries we've made, keep in mind that truth possesses the ability to transform. One word can carry generations of meaning, but it can also reveal profound wisdom when seen in its proper light. More than just an origin story, the story of Adam and Eve serves as a guide for how we should live, love, and relate to each other. Consider this: our creation was not for hierarchy, but for harmony, not for separation, but for unity. And in understanding this, we can begin to rebuild our relationships, communities, and lives on the foundation of equality and respect. Now it's your turn to take this truth and live it. Thanks for watching. Join our community by subscribing to this channel. Until the next video.